She woke up that morning with no idea that her life was about to make headlines. To her, it was supposed to be just another ordinary day. The sun was shining through the tall glass windows of her penthouse apartment, and the city below was buzzing. With its usual noise, she was calm, collected, and focused, like always. As the CEO of a fast-growing tech company, her schedule was packed with meetings and calls. But before diving into work, she needed to stop by the bank. It wasn't something unusual. In fact, she had been to that same bank many times before. She dressed simply. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed power or wealth. She preferred it that way. Even though she was one of the youngest black women CEOs in the country, she didn't need to show it off. Her power was in her mind, in her vision, and in the empire she was building brick by brick. To the outside world, she looked like any other customer walking in with a purpose. And that was fine with her. She liked moving through the world quietly, unnoticed, until the results of her hard work spoke louder than any words could. When she stepped out of her car and entered the bank, everything seemed normal. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the quiet tapping of shoes on polished floors, and the occasional whispers of customers waiting in line. She glanced around and noticed a few people already standing, holding checks, deposit slips, and envelopes. She joined the line, waiting patiently, scrolling briefly through her phone to check a few work emails. To anyone looking, she was just another woman waiting her turn. But what nobody around her knew was that this woman carried a kind of quiet strength. She had fought her way through countless barriers, boardrooms full of doubters, and endless late nights to build her company from scratch. She was used to challenges, used to people underestimating her, and she knew how to win without raising her voice. Yet on this particular morning, she wasn't thinking about any of that. She was only thinking about finishing this simple bank visit and getting back to work. Finally, her turn came. She walked up to the counter and placed a neatly stacked bundle of bills in front of the teller. It wasn't unusual for her to handle large sums of money. Her company's finances often required it, but today, she was simply there to make a personal deposit. She smiled politely, expecting the transaction to be quick and uneventful. For a moment, she looked at the teller behind the glass. He seemed ordinary to mid-30s, pressed shirt, the kind of employee you wouldn't remember. After leaving the bank, she didn't sense anything unusual, no reason to expect trouble. She assumed he would take the money, process it, and hand her a receipt. But as she stood there, waiting, something in his expression shifted. A flicker of doubt, a look that suggested he didn't believe the stack of bills in front of him truly belonged to her. She caught it in his eyes, the judgment, the silent question of whether someone who looked like her should be holding that much money. Still, she remained calm, standing with quiet dignity. Around her, the bank stayed the same. Customers were chatting softly. Phones buzzed with notifications. A child tugged on their mother's arm, pointing toward the candy bowl near the exit. To everyone else, this was just another day. To her, it still felt like one to at least for now. Inside, she was already thinking about the rest of her schedule. She had a conference call later with international investors, a lunch meeting with her executive team, and a draft contract to review for a huge upcoming deal. Her mind was organized, focused, and sharp. This was supposed to be a small errand, in the middle of a much larger, more important day. She had no idea that this small moment in the bank would turn into something so big that the entire business world would be talking about it within 24 hours. The irony of it all was that the woman who quietly stood there was about to make a decision that would shift billions. The money sitting in front of the teller wasn't just cash, was a symbol of years of hard work, sacrifice, and battles won. But to the teller, it was just bills. And to him, it was unbelievable that a black woman could casually place such an amount on the counter. She adjusted her handbag on her shoulder and kept her gaze steady, still waiting for him to do his job. She wasn't impatient, she wasn't angry, she was simply present. To her, this was ordinary. But soon, very soon, she would realize that not everyone saw it the same way. The room felt quiet. Too quiet, though she didn't notice it yet. Something in the air was shifting, like the calm before a storm. The teller's hand hovered over the money, and in that small pause, an entire chain of events was about to begin, events that would cost the bank not just respect, but billions. And yet, at that very second, she was still thinking it was just an ordinary visit. Nothing more, nothing less. He looked up slowly, almost lazily, as if he had seen 1,000 faces that morning, and hers was just another one. But the truth was, his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have. The bank teller wasn't expecting to see such a calm, confident woman placing a thick stack of bills on the counter in front of him. His gaze shifted from the money to her face, then back to the money again. It wasn't a look of routine, it was a look of disbelief, maybe even suspicion. For a few seconds, nothing happened. His hand hovered near the edge of the bills, but he didn't reach for them. Instead, he kept staring at her, as if silently asking, "Is this really yours?" She noticed it. She had seen that look before, many times in her life. At networking events, where she was mistaken for an assistant instead of the keynote speaker. In boardrooms where men twice her age questioned every decision she made, only to later copy her ideas. At charity galas where people looked past her until someone whispered her name and suddenly everyone wanted her attention. That stare, the stare of doubt, wasn't new. But she had hoped that in a simple place like a bank, a professional setting, she wouldn't have to face it again. Around them, the bank felt ordinary. The sound of the printer spitting out receipts, the faint tapping of a pen against a counter, the murmur of a customer explaining their problem to another teller 2 windows down. Nobody else noticed the tension building in this small moment. Nobody else saw the shift in the teller's eyes. But she felt it clearly. The teller tilted his head slightly, his lips tightening as though he was fighting the urge to say something. It wasn't just curiosity, it was judgment. His gaze wasn't neutral. It carried weight, almost like an accusation. To him, the stack of cash on the counter didn't match the woman standing in front of him. He finally spoke, but his tone was clipped, sharp around the edges. "Where did you get this?" The words weren't part of standard banking questions. He could have asked politely, "What kind of deposit would you like? Or do you have an account with us?" But no. First instinct wasn't professionalism. It was doubt. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Instead, she met his gaze with calm, steady eyes. Inside, she felt the familiar sting of being judged before being respected. But outwardly, she stayed quiet, allowing her silence to answer for her. Her posture didn't change. Her hands rested gently on the counter, fingers relaxed. She wasn't going to justify herself. Not here, not today. If he wanted to see her worth, he could read the name on the account. The teller shifted uncomfortably. He looked at the money again, this time with a flicker of irritation. To him, the bills weren't just paper. They were a challenge to his assumptions. His mind raced. Was this woman really who she appeared to be? Could she really have this much money? His pride twisted at the thought. Instead of processing the money, he leaned back slightly, arms crossed. His gaze sharpened, turning colder, as if trying to remind her of her place. He wanted to make her feel small, to strip away the quiet confidence she carried into the room. But she didn't give him that power. She looked at him the way a storm looks at the shore, steady, unmovable, patient. If he thought he could intimidate her, he was wrong. She had survived tougher battles than this. She had negotiated with billion-dollar investors, stood her ground against ruthless competitors, and walked away with victories that no one believed. she could achieve. One teller, one stare, one moment of arrogance, none of it was enough to shake her. And yet, the weight of his gaze still mattered. Not because she was afraid of it, but because she knew what it represented. It was bigger than one man. It was the same invisible barrier she had fought against her whole life. The doubt, the disbelief, the quiet dismissal. It followed her into rooms, into conversations, into decisions. And now, here it was again, in the most ordinary of places. The teller finally reached for the stack, but not with care. His movements were rough, almost careless, as if touching the money offended him. He flipped the bills between his fingers, counting loudly, his eyes flicking up every few seconds as though expecting her to confess something. Each flick of the bills echoed louder than it should have. The room seemed to grow quieter, though no one else noticed. To her, the sound wasn't just money being counted. It was the sound of judgment, the sound of a man deciding she didn't belong here. She kept her eyes on him, unblinking, unshaken. The teller's gaze grew sharper, frustrated by her silence, as though he wanted her to break, to defend herself, to stumble. But she didn't. Her power was in her calm, and he couldn't stand it. Finally, after a long, heavy pause, he slammed the stack down harder than necessary, as if declaring his verdict. The bills scattered slightly across the counter, and for a brief moment, the space between them became a battlefield of pride. And in that quiet, in that tension-filled gaze, the spark was lit. Neither of them knew it yet, but this small act, this gaze, filled with doubt. This silent war of dignity was about to grow into something massive. By morning, this ordinary bank visit would shake the foundations of billion-dollar partnerships. But at that exact moment, it was still just two people staring across a counter. One trying to belittle, the other refusing to bend. The air in the bank felt strangely heavy, though no one else seemed to notice. Customers continued filling out forms, standing in line, scrolling through their phones, and chatting in low voices. To them, this was just another morning. But for the woman standing at the counter, and for the teller behind the glass, everything was shifting. The stack of cash sat there, neat and organized, a silent symbol of her hard work. She had placed it down respectfully, expecting it to be treated with the same professionalism. Instead, what happened next shocked everyone who happened to be watching. With a sudden motion, the teller shoved the stack forward, his hand striking it with a dismissive force. The bills didn't slide neatly across the counter. They burst apart, flying in different directions, scattering like fallen leaves in a storm. Some hit the floor, some landed against the edge of the counter, and others spread out in a messy trail. Gasps broke the quiet hum of the bank. A woman waiting in line covered her mouth. A man leaned forward, eyebrows raised, trying to understand what he had just seen. Even a child holding his mother's hand tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Why did he do that?" The teller leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes hard. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look embarrassed. Instead, there was a faint smirk tugging at his lips, a look of someone who thought they had just proven a point. The CEO's heart pounded, not from fear, but from anger she refused to show. Inside, a storm raged, memories of years of being doubted, questioned, dismissed. But outwardly, she was still, calm, and graceful. She didn't rush to scoop up the bills. She didn't shout or demand respect. She simply stared at him. Her eyes were sharp, steady, and full of power. The silence stretched on, heavier by the second. Someone at the back of the line whispered, "Did you see that?" He threw her money on the floor. Another voice replied, "Why would he do something like that?" The whispers spread, and soon the entire room seemed to pulse with tension. The CEO slowly bent down. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, almost ceremonial. She picked up the bills one by one, her hands steady. To her, this wasn't just money, it was dignity, and she would not let it stay scattered across the floor. Each bill she lifted was like a statement. You cannot reduce me. You cannot define me. You cannot break me. The teller watched, his jaw tightening. Maybe he expected her to yell, to cause a scene, to lose her composure. But her calmness unsettled him more than anger ever could. She wasn't giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. She was giving him something far more powerful. Silence. When she rose to her full height again, the scattered bills once more stacked neatly in her hands. She placed them back on the counter. This time, she didn't push them toward him. She simply rested her hand on top of them, her eyes never leaving his. The look she gave him wasn't one of weakness. It was the look of a woman who knew her worth and who knew his disrespect had already written a story he couldn't erase. The other customers felt it too. The atmosphere had shifted. What had seemed like a small act of rudeness now felt like something much bigger, something heavier. They didn't know who she was, but they sensed her strength, her calm, her quiet fire. And they sensed that what they had just witnessed would not end here. The teller shifted uncomfortably. His smirk faded. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as if realizing too late that he had crossed an invisible line. But it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. The act was complete, and it couldn't be taken back. The CEO finally spoke. Her voice low but clear, carrying through the air like a blade cutting through silence. Is this how you treat your clients? Her words weren't shouted, but they carried more weight than anger ever could. Every customer nearby heard them. The question hung in the air, accusing, undeniable. The teller didn't answer. He shifted in his seat, glanced at the bills, then at her, and then away. His silence was louder than any excuse he could have given. She didn't press further. She didn't need to. Her calm dignity had already turned the spotlight on him. Everyone in the room had seen what happened. Everyone had seen his disrespect. Everyone had seen her strength. She picked up the bills once more and placed them carefully back into her bag. She didn't slam it shut. She didn't storm out. She moved slowly, deliberately. Like someone who had just made a decision far greater than anyone else in that room could understand. As she walked away, the whispers followed her. Some customers shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged looks of anger or pity. The teller left behind at the counter sat frozen, his arrogance crumbling into unease. For the CEO, this wasn't just a humiliating moment, it was a turning point. What the teller had seen as a small act of defiance was, in reality, the spark that would ignite a fire. He thought he had thrown her money on the floor. In truth, he had thrown away something far greater, the trust of a client whose power reached far beyond that bank's walls. By morning, the consequences of this act would ripple across boardrooms, balance sheets, and headlines. But in that exact moment, inside that quiet bank, all anyone could see was a woman standing tall while the teller sank lower into his chair. Trapped in the shadow of his own disrespect. The room still felt heavy with tension, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the disrespect that had just happened. The scattered whispers from other customers had faded, leaving behind an uneasy quiet. The teller sat rigidly behind the glass, his shoulders stiff, his fingers drumming lightly against the counter as if trying to cover up his mistake. But he knew, deep down, that everyone had seen what he had done. The woman, the CEO, stood tall. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her hand on the counter or demand to speak to a manager. Instead, she simply looked at him, calm, collected, unshaken. Her silence was deliberate. Her silence was power. It wasn't the silence of someone who had been defeated. It wasn't the silence of someone who didn't know what to say. It was the silence of a storm, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to release its force. She slowly adjusted. Her bag on her shoulder, her movements graceful and unhurried. Every motion carried meaning. She bent once more to gather the last of the fallen bills, placing them neatly back into the stack. Her hands didn't tremble. Her face didn't betray anger. Her composure was intact, sharper than steel. And when she finally stood straight again, she looked the teller in the eye. Her gaze was unflinching, steady, and deep enough to make him shift nervously in his chair. That look said everything words could not. It said, "You tried to humiliate me. You failed. You wanted me to break. I won't." The teller cleared his throat, pretending to busy himself with the papers on his desk, but his act didn't fool anyone. The customers waiting in line were watching. They weren't just looking at her, they were studying the way she carried herself. The way she didn't give in to the temptation of anger. Her silence was louder than shouting could ever be. Shouting would have made it a fight between her and him. But silence made it clear who was in control. It was no longer her versus the teller. It was the teller versus his own actions, his own arrogance, his own shame. She turned slightly, scanning the room, as if acknowledging the witnesses to what had just happened. People lowered their eyes, embarrassed, perhaps even guilty, as though they should have spoken up, but hadn't. She didn't need their defense. Her silence was her shield, and it was stronger than any voice in the room. The teller fidgeted again, clearly unsettled by the weight of her calmness. He had expected her to snap, to yell, to give him the excuse to dismiss her as angry or emotional. But she had robbed him of that. Instead, she left him drowning in the discomfort of his own disrespect, with nothing to hold on to. One of the customers, an older gentleman in line, leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered, "She handled that better than I ever could." The woman nodded in agreement, eyes fixed on the CEO. It wasn't just her silence that amazed them, it was her dignity, her refusal to let the moment reduce her. The CEO finally moved, but not toward the teller. She reached into her bag, not for her wallet or her ID, but for her phone. With one smooth motion, she unlocked it and tapped the screen, making a note. Her expression remained unreadable, but her action carried weight. The teller's eyes flicked nervously to the phone, then back to her face, unsure of what she was doing. She wasn't recording him. She wasn't taking photos. She was simply making a note for herself, quiet reminder of what had just happened, a record that she would not forget. That single motion, so small and subtle, carried more threat than 100 shouted words. The silence stretched on, and still she said nothing. When she finally did speak, her voice was low, almost soft, but it carried through the room with sharp clarity. "I think I've seen enough." That was all, just 6 words. But they cut through the air like a blade. The teller blinked, caught off guard. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew whatever he said now would not erase what had already been witnessed. The CEO picked up the bills once more, placed them neatly into her bag, and zipped it shut. She didn't slam it, didn't rush, didn't show anger. Instead, she moved with deliberate calmness, like someone who already knew how this story would end. She didn't need to fight here in the bank. She had a bigger stage, a louder voice, and far more powerful tools than anger. As she turned to leave, her silence followed her like a cloak. Every step she took echoed across the marble floor, each one louder than the whispers, now rippling again. Through the crowd, customers watched her go, some with admiration, some with shame, some with awe. The teller sat frozen, his smirk gone, his confidence shattered. He tried to busy himself again, rearranging papers that didn't need rearranging, tapping keys on his computer without focus. But nothing could erase the truth. Everyone in that room knew what had happened. And he knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The CEO pushed open the glass door of the bank, and the sound of the busy street flooded in car horns' footsteps, the hum of the city. But inside the bank, it was still silent. Her silence had left behind an echo that no one could ignore. To her, that silence was not weakness. It was strength. She had carried herself with dignity, with restraint, and with a power that no disrespect could diminish. She knew her response wasn't loud, but it was unforgettable. And that was enough. Little did anyone know that silence would soon grow into a roar. By morning, her quiet, measured response inside the bank would lead to a decision that would shake the entire financial world. But for now, she walked away in silence, leaving behind a teller who didn't yet realize he had just destroyed something far greater than a simple transaction. Asterisk outside the bank. The city moved as though nothing had happened. Cars honked impatiently. Street vendors shouted about fresh fruit and hot food. People hurried past each other, faces buried in their phones. To everyone else, it was just another ordinary day. But for her, everything was different now. She stepped onto the sidewalk, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, her face calm and unreadable. The cool morning air brushed against her, skin carrying the faint scent of coffee shops and car exhaust. She held her bag firmly, the very same bag that now carried the stack of bills the teller had so carelessly thrown to the floor to anyone watching. She looked like a woman leaving the bank after a routine errand. No one could have guessed that. She carried a storm inside her, a storm that would shake boardrooms, tear through partnerships, and cost a bank billions by the next morning. Because what the teller didn't know, what no one in that lobby knew, was that the woman he had disrespected wasn't just any customer. She wasn't someone struggling to prove herself. She wasn't someone who needed validation. She was the CEO of a rising empire, a company that had become the talk of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and international investors. She was power disguised. In grace, her name was already whispered in circles that the teller could never dream of entering. Business leaders across the globe knew her as the sharp strategist who had turned a small startup into a billion-dollar powerhouse. Politicians admired her for her philanthropy and community work. Competitors feared her for her ability to disrupt industries with bold, fearless moves. And yet, she never wore her power on her sleeve. She walked through the world quietly, without bragging or demanding attention. That humility made her even more dangerous in a world where arrogance often blinded men at the top. This bank visit was never supposed to be extraordinary. She hadn't planned to reveal who she was or to demand special treatment. She wanted nothing more than to make a quick deposit and move on to her packed schedule. But life had a way of turning the smallest sparks into wildfires, because what the teller also didn't know was that this very bank was on the verge of finalizing a partnership with her company. A partnership worth not thousands, not millions, but $2 billion. It wasn't a deal the bank could afford to lose. They had been fighting hard for it, competing with other institutions, bending rules, and offering incentives just to get her signature on the contract. Executives at the top had spent months preparing proposals, arranging dinners, sending in their best negotiators. They wanted her business badly. To them, she was the golden key that could open doors to the future of finance. But all of that crumbled the moment a single teller decided to judge her by her skin color, her gender, her very presence. His disrespect wasn't just personal, it became a reflection of the institution he worked for, and she knew it. As she walked toward her car, she wasn't thinking about the money scattered on the floor. She wasn't thinking about the whispers of the customers or the silence she had left behind. She was thinking about the bigger picture. It's the quiet power she held in her hands. The choice she could make that would ripple far beyond that bank's walls. Inside her car, she placed her bag on the passenger seat and sat still for a moment. She looked out the window, watching the ordinary rhythm of the city, and allowed herself a small, cold smile. The teller thought he had belittled her. What he had really done was hand her the sharpest weapon of all, the truth. The truth of how easily this bank revealed its arrogance. The truth of how fragile respect really was. She opened her phone and glanced at her messages. A dozen notifications blinked at her from investors, board members, and business partners.
Sure.
The upcoming $2 billion deal was at the center of all of them. Meetings had been scheduled. Draft contracts had been exchanged. Everyone was waiting for her final word. She knew the bank believed the deal was already theirs. They were confident, even smug. They thought her signature was a formality, a matter of time. But now, time had run out. Her finger hovered over the screen as she opened her contact list. At the very top were the names of people who shaped industries, people whose decisions moved markets. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Her power was not in speed, was in certainty. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes steady, her voice calm as she made a note to herself. Tonight, I make the call. And with that decision, everything began to shift. The teller, still sitting smugly at his counter, had no idea that his careless act had already cost his bank the future. He thought the story had ended when she walked out the door. But the real story was just beginning. By nightfall, phones would ring in offices across the city. Emails would fly between executives in panic. Investors would demand answers. And by morning, headlines would scream about the billion-dollar deal that vanished overnight. But for now, she sat in her car in complete silence, her calm face hiding the truth. She was holding the power of an empire in her hands. And she was about to use it. The evening sun dipped low over the city skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of gold and crimson. Her office window reflected the fading light, but inside, the atmosphere was calm, almost too calm. She sat at her desk, the same quiet composure she had carried all day wrapped tightly around her like armor. Papers were neatly stacked. Her laptop hummed softly. To anyone peeking in, it looked like the end of an ordinary workday. But it wasn't ordinary at all. She had carried the weight of the bank incident with her since morning. Not in anger, but in silence. That moment, the shove, the disrespect, the scattered bills played in her mind again and again, not as humiliation, but as revelation. It wasn't about the teller anymore. It was about the institution he represented. And tonight, she would decide their fate. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Notifications lit up the screen. Messages from board members. Alerts from her legal team. Updates from international investors waiting for confirmation on the $2 billion partnership. Everyone expected a green light. Everyone believed the deal was already sealed. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment. In the quiet hum of the room, she remembered every barrier she had broken to get here. The long nights, the doubters. The ones who said she didn't belong. And now, a single bank teller had reminded her that respect wasn't guaranteed in. When she stood at the top, when she opened her eyes again, they were sharper, colder. Her hand reached for the phone. She scrolled through her contacts slowly, deliberately. Names passed by on the screen, powerful names. Men and women who moved billions with their signatures. People who sat on the boards of international banks, corporations, and governments. She stopped at one. The name of the senior partner who had championed the bank's deal with her company. A man who had sent countless emails, taken her out to dinners, promised her the bank would treat her company like family. He had smiled, shaken her hand, and sworn loyalty. He had no idea that one of his employees had undone months of his work in less than a minute. Her finger hovered over the screen for only a second. Before she pressed the call button, the line rang. Once, twice. On the third ring, his familiar voice came through, cheerful and confident. "Good evening, CEO. I was just about to call you. I assume everything's on track. We're ready to move forward." Her silence on the line stretched for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, almost too calm. Something happened today. The partner's voice faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, what sort of something?" she told him. She didn't embellish. She didn't shout. She described exactly what happened at the bank that morning, how the teller looked at her, how he questioned her, how he shoved her money onto the floor in front of everyone. She told the story in her calm, steady voice, each word hitting like a hammer. On the other end of the line, silence. The partner inhaled sharply. That must have been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice tight. "I assure you, that doesn't represent who we are as a bank." She let his words hang there, empty and weak. Then she replied, "It represents enough." The weight of her voice left no room for argument. He stumbled, trying to recover. "Please, let us fix this. We'll handle the employee." "Will," she cut him off, her tone still calm, but final. "No, it's not about one employee. It's about the culture you allow. The way you let people see me, treat me. If one person feels free to act this way, then your entire institution carries the same sickness." Silence again. This time, it wasn't hers. It was his. The silence of a man realizing the deal he had bragged about for months was slipping out of his hands. Finally, she spoke once more. "The partnership is over. Effective immediately." He gasped, his voice desperate now. "You can't be serious. $2 billion, do you realize what this means?" She replied softly but firmly. "Yes, I know exactly what it means. Do you?" Her question hit him harder than any insult could, because she wasn't talking about money anymore. She was talking about respect, dignity, equality. Things he couldn't buy back with a bigger contract or a sweeter deal. She ended the call, just like that. No long explanation. No second chances. The phone slipped from her hand and rested on the desk. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Her heart wasn't racing. Her hands weren't trembling. She felt steady, strong, at peace with her decision. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, tiny stars against the darkening sky. Somewhere across town, that teller was probably eating dinner, blissfully unaware that his careless act had just collapsed a $2 billion deal. By tomorrow, his managers, his directors, the entire chain of executives would know, and panic would spread like wildfire. But she wasn't thinking about their panic. She was thinking about something far greater. She had proven that her dignity was not for sale, that no amount of money could make her overlook disrespect. And in doing so, she had sent a message not just to one bank, but to the entire world. Respect isn't optional. Asterisk, the city slept. But inside the offices of the bank, no one was resting. What had begun as a single phone call earlier in the evening now spread like a spark catching dry grass. Racing through every level of the institution with unstoppable speed, it started with the senior partner. After hanging up with her, he had slumped into his chair, his heart pounding. He stared at the phone in disbelief, replaying her words in his head. "The partnership is over. Effective immediately." His mind scrambled, searching for ways to undo the damage, but the finality in her voice echoed louder than anything he could imagine. He knew she meant it. Within minutes, emails flew across time zones. Urgent call with CEO went badly, partnership at risk. The message was short, but it carried the weight of a bomb. Executives on the other side of the globe woke to blinking phones and panicked subject lines. At first, they didn't believe it. $2 billion, gone over one interaction. Some scoffed, thinking it was exaggerated. But as details trickled in, the truth became undeniable. A teller had disrespected her in front of a lobby full of witnesses. And the woman he had disrespected wasn't just a client, she was the client. The one they had been chasing for over a year. The one who could open doors to a new era of partnerships. By midnight, emergency calls filled the bank's upper floors. Conference rooms lit up. Sleeves were rolled. Voices rose in heated arguments. How could this happen? One director demanded, his fist slamming on the table. Do you know how much we invested in securing this deal? Another snapped. $2 billion? Do you understand what this will do to our stock tomorrow morning? Panic spread. Strategies were thrown onto the table. Send flowers, issue a public apology, fly out executives first thing in the morning. But no plan seemed strong enough to reverse her decision. The calmness of her voice haunted them all. She hadn't threatened. She hadn't bargained. She had simply ended it. Downstairs, the teller who had started it all still had no idea. He was at home, his tie loosened, the television glowing faintly in the background as he ate leftovers from the fridge. He had no clue that while he lounged comfortably, his employers were tearing their hair out, their empire shaking because of him. At 1 a.m., the bank CEO was pulled into the chaos. Woken by an urgent call, he listened in stunned silence as his team explained what had happened. His voice, normally steady and commanding, cracked with disbelief. A teller, he asked, his tone low and dangerous. A teller did this. Yes. Sir, came the answer. She was humiliated in front of witnesses. She described the incident herself. The CEO's silence was worse than anger. He knew instantly that this was bigger than just money. The woman's reputation was unshakable. If she walked away, others would follow. Investors would whisper. Clients would question. Reporters would dig. By 2 a.m., the first draft of a press statement was being written. Words like regret. Unfortunate does not reflect our values were typed and deleted over and over. But every version felt weak, hollow. They all knew no sentence on a page could erase what had been done. Meanwhile, she sat in her penthouse. Lights dimmed, sipping tea as though the world outside wasn't on fire. She didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. She knew what was happening. She knew the ripple her decision had caused. Her silence was now echoing across boardrooms, turning into panic and desperation. At 3 a.m., more calls were made. The bank's legal team scrambled, suggesting ways to salvage the deal. The marketing department begged for time to spin the story before it hit the media. But the executives all knew the truth. There was no spinning this. She had already moved on, and the world would soon know why. By dawn, the collapse was complete. The deal was dead. Documents that had been prepared for signing were shredded. Investors who had been promised historic returns were now demanding explanations. Rival banks, sensing blood in the water, circled like sharks, preparing to lure her business away. The bank's stock opened lower that morning, and as whispers turned into headlines, the fall deepened. Reporters pieced together fragments of the story. $2 billion deal canceled overnight. Anonymous sources cite incident with client. The full truth hadn't yet reached the public, but it would. And when it did, it wouldn't just be a business story. It would be a story about power, dignity, and the cost of disrespect. In one building, executives stared at glowing screens, their faces pale with exhaustion. Their empire, once so steady, now trembled on the edge of scandal. They cursed the teller, cursed the bad luck, cursed themselves for letting arrogance blind them. And somewhere across the city, the woman at the center of it all looked out her window at the rising sun. Her phone buzzed endlessly, but she ignored it. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to defend her choice. The collapse was not hers to manage, it was theirs. For her, the decision had been simple. She would not compromise her dignity, not for any amount of money. And by morning, the world was learning that her silence carried more weight than any contract. The collapse wasn't loud, like a building falling to rubble. It was quiet, like cracks spreading through glass until it shattered completely. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the bank's carefully built image had already begun to break apart. And the teller, he would wake up to headlines he couldn't comprehend. He would never understand the storm he had unleashed with one careless act. But she understood. She had always understood. Power isn't about shouting the loudest. Sometimes, power is walking away quietly and watching the empire on the other side burn. Asterisk, the morning light crept over the city, spilling across glass towers and busy streets. But inside the bank's headquarters, the mood was anything but bright. Phones rang non-stop. Executives rushed through hallways with dark circles under their eyes, clutching reports they no longer knew how to spin. Screens flashed with breaking news. The whispers from the night before had turned into headlines. $2 billion partnership. Canceled overnight. Sources cite disrespect toward black woman CEO. Bank faces crisis after sudden collapse of historic deal. The story spread like wildfire. At first, it was confined to business networks and financial blogs, but within hours, it jumped to mainstream news outlets, then to social media, where it exploded. Hashtags trended worldwide. People debated furiously online, outraged not just at the loss of money, but at the reason behind it. Clips surfaced from customers who had been in the bank that day. A woman described how the teller shoved the cash, how the CEO bent down to pick up every bill with calm dignity. Another witness recalled the silence she carried, the way she walked out without raising her voice. The story wasn't just about a teller anymore. It was about respect, about power, about how one act of arrogance could cost billions. The bank scrambled. They issued a statement full of polished words. This does not reflect our values. We are deeply regretful. We are investigating thoroughly. But the public wasn't moved. Their words sounded hollow against the image of a powerful woman treated with disdain in her own city. Inside boardrooms across the world, leaders took notice. CEOs, directors, and managers read the headlines and sat in uncomfortable silence. They weren't thinking about the teller. They were thinking about their own employees, their own institutions. They were asking themselves a dangerous question. How many moments like this happen in our company? How many small acts of disrespect could cost us everything? Meanwhile, she sat in her penthouse, away from the chaos. The morning sunlight poured through tall windows, catching the shine of her teacup as she stirred it slowly. She hadn't turned on the television. She didn't need to. She already knew how the story was spreading. Her phone vibrated endlessly. On the table, calls from reporters, offers from rival banks, requests for interviews. She ignored them all. To her, it wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about revenge. It was about principle. When she walked out of that bank the previous day, she hadn't planned to destroy a partnership. But when the moment came, she refused to let dignity be treated as a bargaining chip. $2 billion meant nothing if respect wasn't part of the deal. Her silence had spoken louder than any press conference ever could. By afternoon, business analysts were already calling it the $2 billion lesson. Talk shows debated it endlessly. Some praised her strength, saying she had set a new standard for leadership. Others criticized her decision, claiming it was too extreme, that business should come before personal feelings. But even in the criticism, her power was undeniable. The world was talking about her. The world was learning from her. The teller, finally realizing the scale of what had happened, sat in a small office, his career crumbling around him. He muttered excuses he hadn't meant it. It wasn't personal. People were exaggerating. But no excuse mattered now. He had become the face of arrogance. The symbol of a moment that cost billions. The executives, exhausted and humiliated, tried desperately to rebuild trust. They reached out to other clients, hoping to prove they still had value. But the damage was done. Rivals swooped in, offering her better deals, better terms, better respect. She didn't rush to accept. She had the luxury of time. She had the power of choice. In quiet conversations, women across industries shared her story as inspiration. "Did you hear what she did?" they whispered. She walked away. She didn't let them buy her silence. For many, it became a symbol not just of business strength, but of dignity defended without apology. By evening, the headlines had crystallized into something bigger than finance. They weren't just about money lost. They were about respect earned. They were about a reminder that arrogance, when left unchecked, destroys empires. The lesson was simple, yet powerful. Disrespect has a cost. And sometimes that cost is everything. As the sun set again, the city lights flickered on, and she stood by her window, gazing out at the skyline. She thought about how quickly everything had changed in just 24 hours. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't fought. She had simply stood her ground, walked away, and let the truth unfold on its own. Her lesson was clear. True power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks quietly out the door, leaves the world to watch an empire collapse behind it. And as the headlines continued to spread, she knew this story would outlive the moment, would become an example, a warning, a tale retold in boardrooms, classrooms, and homes. Respect isn't optional. And when you deny it, you risk losing everything.